In 1963, a young biblical scholar by the name of Christer Stendahl published an article in a rather obscure theological journal. Actually, all theological journals are rather obscure. This article was entitled "Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West." And in it, Stendahl basically accused the Protestant tradition, of which he himself was very much a product, of having gotten Paul all wrong, of basically having fundamentally misread the writings of that prominent apostle, having misread Paul by reading him almost entirely through the eyes of Martin Luther, resulting in a view of Paul that was a lot more Luther than it was the apostle himself. And Stendahl was a Lutheran himself. This article hit a nerve, and it set off a re-examination of Paul and his writings that over the years eventually came to be called the New Perspective. And that reassessment of Paul, that new perspective, is still going strong today. Interestingly enough, this one article was pretty much the only thing of substance that Stendahl ever published. But with that one article, he had a profound effect upon the church and its understanding of Paul. It is a very different Paul that we encounter in the New Testament today than was the case 50 or 60 years ago. One of the major aspects of Paul that this new perspective claims that we got wrong was Paul's whole take on the law. Now, while Paul would no doubt have agreed with the traditional Protestant formula that we are saved by faith and not by good works, though Paul never put it exactly like that himself, still Paul would have drawn a very different set of conclusions from that statement than we do. For one thing, Paul really didn't have much problem with the law per se. His problem, and certainly at first, was almost entirely with certain laws, and in particular with the laws mandating circumcision as well as the various dietary rules. And his problem even with those laws wasn't so much theological as it was purely practical. A problem with the effect that those laws tended to have in actual practice. You could say that for Paul, the problem with the law was a problem of unintended consequences. The recognition that he came to, largely because of the course of his own ministry, that these particular laws in actual practice tended to have consequences that were never really intended, and yet consequences that very often subverted the original purpose of the law, shall we say the spirit of the law. For example, one of the problems with laws that Paul noted was the fact that you could become so focused on the letter of the law and fulfilling the letter of the law down to the very last detail that often you didn't even notice that you had never gotten around to attempting to fulfill the spirit of the law at all. You could bend over backwards to keep from ever harming your neighbor physically. You might never steal so much as a blade of grass from your neighbor's yard. You might never even think of bearing false witness against your neighbor, and you might do all of that and yet never get around to actually loving your neighbor, which is what the point of all those rules was in the first place. What the spirit of the law was, as opposed to merely the letter. Now, another problem with the law that Paul ran up against in actual practice were those situations where there was no law, where there was no rule either commanding certain actions or prohibiting them. But as Paul experienced in his work with congregations, just because there isn't a rule against something doesn't mean that something is necessarily a good idea to do. But if one insists upon drawing guidance for one's actions from the law and nothing but the law, and there's no law, then there's no guidance either. Nothing to keep you from doing harm, whether to yourself or anyone else, when something is not, strictly speaking, prohibited, but just happens to be not a very good thing to do. Such cases, the absence of the law doesn't absolve you of a responsibility to do the right thing. But what is the right thing when there is no law? For Paul, what was clearly needed was some sense of a higher law that could provide guidance over a broad range of potential situations, rather than attempting to formulate a specific law for every conceivable occurrence, something that in actual practice simply can't be done because you can't foresee everything that might ever happen. Well, that higher law, of course, is what Paul sometimes calls faith, and other times, depending on the situation, calls love. You see, while Paul acknowledged the fact that rules are enormously helpful, and at times clearly necessary to the well-being of any human society from the family on up, he also knew that there always needs to be something more. Some higher law, some grasp of the big picture, some sense of the whole. And for Paul, that was faith. An utter sense of trust in God, and thus living one's life in the light of that trust, on the basis of that trust. Sure, rules and laws and traditions governing our behavior can all, generally speaking, prove very helpful. But it is faith that gives ultimate direction to our lives. Thus, faith that must always guide the law. Because without faith, the law, any law, can all too easily end up having those unintended consequences and produce results other than those we intended. Which is why one is said to be ultimately justified by faith and not by works of the law. For without faith, the law is simply of limited use, and at times can even be dangerous. The law can't get you where you want to be. Which is why Abraham and Sarah were so important to Paul. For they were both considered exemplars of righteousness, that is to say, of right with Godness, despite their having lived long before the law was given to Moses atop Mount Sinai. So theirs was quite literally a righteousness not based on works of the law, at least not on the basis of the law of Moses. And in fact, Genesis makes the explicit claim that Paul refers to in Romans, makes the claim that Abraham believed the Lord, that is, that Abraham believed the promise that the Lord made that he and Sarah would have a child, and that it was that belief, that faith, that trust in God that was reckoned to him as righteousness. The verse from Genesis that Paul quotes in this letter to the Romans, the portion of that letter that we read this morning for our epistle. The point is that Abraham was considered righteous not because he did this or didn't do that, but because he trusted in the Lord. And he lived his life, his whole life, in the light of that trust, which is to say that Abraham and Sarah lived by faith. They lived with the big picture, which is exactly what Jesus was looking for in his disciples. Someone who is willing to live, to walk by faith. When Jesus called people to follow them, he didn't say, if you want to be my disciple, these are the rules. You have to do X, or you have to do Y, and you can't do Z. It's not what he said at all. He said, if you want to follow me, you have to follow me. You have to follow me, not do this or do that. And note, he doesn't even say where he's going or what's likely to happen to you along the way, though the mention of the cross here makes it pretty clear that they're not going to a picnic. No, what Jesus was and still is looking for is a fundamental commitment to him and a repudiation of any other concern, agenda, or priority that would distract us from that ultimate allegiance. And that's exactly what those who would be his disciples always found so difficult. Because we all had their own agendas, their own concerns, which is why they so often to be on a different wavelength than Jesus and just didn't seem to get it. And it was at such times that Jesus accused them of having set their minds on human things rather than on the divine. Or to put it another way, he accused them of setting their minds on the letter of the law rather than the spirit, of being so caught up in the details that they couldn't see the big picture. Needless to say, we're all guilty of that, which is not at all surprising because in many ways it is the human dilemma. As mortal creatures with a very finite lifespan, we have a natural tendency to get all tied up in the details, which is really more the human dimension, and fail to grasp the big picture, the really big picture, which is more the divine realm, and that is to say then the dimension of faith. And when that happens, when we lack that faith dimension in our lives, when we lose sight of the big picture in which all of this is contained, then we tend to lose perspective on the events that are happening around us and our own efforts, even our best efforts, when lacking that guidance, when they're not directed by faith, often fall victim then to that problem of unintended consequences. The same problem that Paul had with circumcision and the dietary rules, though in our own case, of course, those are not the issues involved. But we have our own issues. And this happens all the time in churches. In this and every other church at least that's made up of human beings, when people out of the very best of intentions and motivated by an intense desire to do the right thing, nonetheless end up doing a lot of damage to the church, a lot of damage to other church members and even their own families because they can't see the forest for the trees. They don't see the big picture. And the problem is that for most of us, we just can't see beyond ourselves and our own set of concerns. And of course, we're all absolutely certain that we see things right and everybody else has it wrong. But again, That's why Jesus says, if you want to be my follower, you've got to deny yourself. You've got to set aside your own agenda, your own issues, and your own concerns, and follow him. Because in the end, this isn't about us. It's about him.